really happy that we have our month coming up with the philosophy portal. So I wanted to bring that up.
That would be very fun. Well, I hope you have a good adventure. No, it was really fun speaking with Cadell about fiction. I'd be curious any thoughts you have after our talk with Cadell. We have a month coming up on Philosophy Portal about under the wing and fiction and art. And so anyone wants to show up, please. It would be, and Jockin, Luber, great to see you. But we were just talking with Cadell on the relationship between fiction, art, how these things go together. I'd be curious any thoughts you have right now, Michelle, about that.
Yeah. I can speak for a moment. Yeah. Thank you, and thanks for I'm happy to be here. Like I said, the event the month coming up at the Philosophy Portal is very exciting. Considering basically the relationship between literature and philosophy, and I think that's really important because, like to me, it's always for me kind of, if I to sort of put it in a simple way, literature that or fiction and reading stories that have the philosophical component or like background are, I think it's inherent anyway. Like you can't get one that doesn't have philosophy in the background. But I think when it's more intentionally, intentionally is not the right word. When there's in a sense, I mean, basically when there's a real robust push for your ideas and a push for your comfort zone. I think there's something really profound about that. And I think that it's some of the best philosophy is fiction, honestly, So anyways, I'll just say that, and I'll leave it there.
No, outstanding. And I'll give it to Mr. Luber. Yeah, I'm thinking about after we talk. So there's the idea of the death of the author, Roland Barthes, and you can't really arrive at the author anymore from the text, and that would apply to many forms of art. Well, if we tie that together with kind of the Christian atheism, we had the conference at Philosophy Portal with Cadell on the idea that the death of the author, you can tie with that, like the death of the master signifier, that kind of leaves you to the work of Holy Spirit, which of course would align with this perhaps idea of, the text is trying to find out the author's intention, right? The reason we're doing this is to get at the author's intention, as opposed to what is the text in of itself. So I've been thinking about, the difference between the death of the author and what would it mean to be talking about the Holy Spirit of the author or art of the Holy Spirit, like communities of Holy Spirit in that Christian atheist sense after the death of the author. What does it mean to have communities of literature and art that are not reifying a master signifier of some kind? I was thinking about that after we spoke, because again, I thought like it's just very interesting that for us and Under the Wing, and I'll give it to Mr. Luber, you're really trying, your goal is so much to not be in the story, where Mary Rose and Esperanza and Eve all become characters who you yourself as the authors speak about as if they are their own people. They really don't feel as if they are reducible to your intentions. And it's funny because for us, the success of a good piece of work is when it feels like it's separate from you. Obviously, it only exists because of you, but the work is not, like you could easily imagine the work never being connected back to you. Like if it was just on a desert island and people read it, it would be easy to imagine them never knowing Daniel and Michelle wrote it, or never feeling like they needed to know the intentions of the author. And that kind of removal of the quote unquote big other becomes an important success for us at a work as a work of art, which then actually makes space for the communities of readers and different people to talk about the work. But let me pass it to Mr. Luber here. Mr. Luber, thank you for being here, sir.
Glad to be here. I was listening to the previous net talk, which I think is relevant to this conversation. So I kind of wanted to speak to like Ebert, what he was saying in the beginning of the last net talk, because as you know, Daniel, like I've struggled with this very much so with the theme book, and we've talked about that a decent bit during that year-long grind with the theme book. But this is where like Bard, for example, like Bard will say like philosophy is second. It's like stories first, narratology's first, and then philosophy second. Now I haven't spoken to him on this point yet, but like something that I don't agree with. It's actually, I think, philosophy first, story first. So like when you are presenting content like story content, it does need to be accessible to the masses. Like it does need to have this pulling in where, you know, for example, you can't speak. If I were to present a film and it was all in Chinese with no subtitles, like no one's going to understand it. So, you know, there's certain foundational things that have to occur to like bring you into the realm of understanding. Now, this realm of understanding, I think, is very philosophical. It's inherently philosophical, kind of like what Michelle was saying. So I think if I were to postulate what it's like in caveman times, it's like before there was like, you know, a concrete understanding of how to communicate language, there was experiences happening still. And those experiences could not be storyified until there was some level of communicatable understanding that was obtained. Then you retroactively look at that experience with that understanding and you storify it. So it's like you get the certain degree of philosophy in order to be able to express the story. And that's why I personally think it's philosophy first, storytelling second, even though it may seem like the other way around. So with that being said, with Ebert, it is very difficult. I would say it's impossible to, you know, express philosophy for the masses. I think that's like not its purpose. And I think, you know, if you make it more into an application, then that's how you kind of take away the complexity and make it more concrete and procedural. But if you're trying to be truly philosophical, I think you have to basically do your own thing, and then someone enters that world, and then in entering that world, content can emerge, more particularity, stories, art, those type of things can emerge out of it. So, oh, it's getting loud over here. I'm going to walk away from that. Sorry. So the reason why I'm saying this is because I think when you talk about fiction, there is this level of philosophy that Michelle's talking about that is always present. And the question is, with that philosophy, how metaphysical is it? Because I think the more metaphysical it is, the harder it is to actually communicate that in like a story platform, in a relatable platform. Because I think metaphysics is inherently not relatable. Like you have to find, like the philosopher has to go out and find their relation to metaphysics. They have to, the question of like, why is it the case that there's beings versus no beings at all? Like that Heidegger question. That you have to find your own relationship to that question. And in that relationship to that question is how you develop your own philosophy, how you have your own, it's so relation based because metaphysics is like it's like an open juxtaposition. And what I mean by that is it gives an enumerant, an open enumerant, so to speak, for you to fill in the rest of the enumeration with the relation itself. So, you know, this is how, you know, finding your relation to philosophy is the first step to making stories. And that's, you know, to me, part of the thematic process of finding a relation, because that's all it is essentially is like a very trying to be pragmatic about that to some degree, because I think it's a lost art is finding your relation. But I will say that from a storytelling perspective, it is on the creator to make it make sense. It's not on the audience to find sense in it, because when you find sense in it from the audience perspective, I think it's a little evil. I think it's a little fucked up, basically, because I think what you're doing is, and we've talked about this with beauty, where the viewer is willing, they're projecting their own meaning onto it. And the artwork itself isn't polysemantic in its own right. And it's not bestowing its overwhelming amount of meaning onto the viewer for them to discover meaning. Instead, they're willing meaning. And like, that's been a whole problem of basically, I mean, for me, not having a thematic approach, which simply just means having a concrete relation to philosophy insofar as it directly relates to something, to some tangible unfolding, which I call story.
No, magnificent, and thank you for all of that. And Andrew and Ross Bird, it's good to see you. Mr. Bird just had a piece published in Mere Orthodox about that I think is very, very well written. Very, very nice to have you, sir. And I think that's a lovely example of a certain narrative that can be used to understand, say, the movement between the Torah and the gospel, the first and second tension. That then it's very interesting because you mentioned a relation and the sort of working out of a relation. It is interesting to think of that narrative of, say, God wanting to know people, but if he knows them too quickly, it destroys them. But then, of course, too slowly may also be problematic, right? And I think we were speaking with Tim Adlin and Aspasia last night on this question that Tim asked of when should you make the unconscious conscious, right? What is a good time by which to do it? Because, of course, if I make the unconscious conscious too quickly, or the assumptions or maybe the family dynamics that are proving causing troubles in the family, it may overwhelm people and may destroy them, right? But if I never make what is unconscious, or, you know, the elephant in the room, we might say. So by unconscious, Adlin here is mostly referring to, you know, when you know, that experience of being in a group and or a business or an organization and you feel like it's a minefield. There's minefields. I was speaking with Jockin about this the other night, right? And everyone kind of knows there's minefields, but it's not like visual. You just kind of feel it. So there's these things that people are pretending are not there that they're trying to leave out of consciousness. But of course, if you don't ever bring it into the foreground, the minefield never goes away. And you always feel like you're walking on eggshells. There are some things you can say, other things you cannot, excuse me, and things get worse from there. Mr. Parsons, it's good to see you. And of course, if anyone wants to speak, just feel free to raise your hands. I'll pass it to Jockin and Luber here. But you see, of course, so if you never bring unconscious dynamics into the forefront, then the unconscious is going to run the show. But then if you bring the unconscious into consciousness and you're not ready for it, it may destroy everything because people aren't ready to handle the real too quickly, right? But of course, so another way to put it is the unconscious ends up doing your relationships for you. It does the unconsciousness for you. It does the organizations for you. But if you're going to make the unconscious conscious, you better be ready to do the work of your relationships. You better be able to do the work of the organization and have the capacities to handle that. Otherwise, perhaps you have unveiled too quickly. Perhaps you have brought something into consciousness without the right art, etc., so forth. Well, what's very interesting here, the question, I guess, arises to what you're saying, Mr. Luber, on what is the story? Is the story is the story the process of the bringing the unconscious into consciousness, like how one goes about that? Or is the narrative the recognition of the unconscious dynamics? And it becomes just kind of very interesting because if you say, well, the story is what created the unconscious dynamics, not really. That's the history of the unconscious dynamics. It would seem as if you actually, to get a story, need the unconscious dynamics to be there first, as opposed to simply cause and effect, right? Unless we're going to conflate story and causality and just mere facticity, right? But once there is a thing that needs to be brought into consciousness, once there is a quote-unquote God that needs to be unveiled, then it seems you have the causer and the tension of bringing something into story. And so if that's the case, the relation is first and then the narrative, of course. And then the question becomes, now, I believe Mr. Bard, when he says narratology, though, basically means metaphysics. Like, he uses narratology as a term almost interchangeably with metaphysics. And he sees metaphysics as a certain narrative by which we then structure various vectors. Like every vector has a narrative. It has a certain way of understanding how physics unfolds, biology, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, also Mr. Bard may say that he basically believes relations are ontological. Therefore, relations are first, but it's more that they're just given. There are relations because there are beings, right? Well, under that framework, you're still placing relations first, but you're just saying they're the possibility of sequence versus the first piece in a sequence, right? Like you need relations to even have a thing to talk about sequence. So then it might just be a wording matter that you need to get into at that point. Yes, Mr. Luber, please.
Okay, real quick, just to jump in, 2 points. The latter is going to be about what Bart says, because I've been learning a lot about his thinking through IDW and all that shit. But the first is what you're bringing out with story is basically, if you're thinking about how to bring the unconscious to the forefront of the conscious, the story, ironically, it'll be top down.
Yeah.
It won't come out naturally.
Right.
Now, what the whole ontology of relations does is it provides an apathetic movement that creates a passive pressure. And in the passive pressure, the unconscious on its own accord will come to the forefront of the story. So it's how to put, so the name of the game in creating something that's accessible for the masses is, how do I create a circle, if you will, where people will naturally, the gravity of the circle will bring them in, and the pressure will make them have their own realization. Now, I think music is much easier to actually do that. So like, I remember a while ago, I was at the hospital on a net call, and Ebert was talking about music, and I brought up his song Truth, where there's this whistle component, and there's so many songs like Quentin Tarantino that has this like whistle component to it. And the idea here is that using that material, if you will, and then having your own, Dasein, your own relation to that material, and you develop this relationship in this apathetic, passive way, the tension of this relation will create a circle with that song, will draw in people in order to have their own relation to that initial component that brought in the artist. So the artist has their that very first draw in based off of finding their own relation, and then in expressing their relation, others will then draw in to have their own relation. And I think doing that means you start with a short circuit. So I was listening to something Slavoj Žižek was saying the other day, where it's like, Karl Marx, he was, scared of people becoming objects. But what ironically happened, it's like Karl Marx is like, how do I not turn the individual into a commodity? And basically what happened was he only thought through the short circuit in that way, and therefore the ironic thing happened in a certain respect. And instead of thinking about it in that short circuit way, it's seeing the short circuit, like seeing it as true, but then seeing it as not the only possibility. So like Slavoj Žižek said, well, there's also what happened is the subject, the fake subject. So you didn't become the object, you became a fake subject. And that's like another short circuit that is within that Karl Marx short circuit that isn't prevalent. It's essentially the FedEx arrow sign within the concept. So the point there is that tracing your own apathetic pressure is basically finding the in a short circuit, break up short circuit, and using that movement to create the content. And it all starts with relation.
Not at all. And Mr. Rivera, it's good to see you. I just finished your talk with Aspasia, which I really enjoyed. And not to jump in, but to what you're saying on the short circuit, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. There's this interesting idea, like, say, again, if we're using, based on Mr. Bird's piece, on this idea of, okay, it can be, say, the short circuit of the fall, and the irony that then makes you kind of move into the story of God's unveiling and veiling. to get to know you, but if he does it too quickly, it destroys you. It could be the strike of beauty. It could be the glory of creation, the mystery, the beauty of the Quran, like that is moving you into the story. But what's very interesting in a theological context, there is notions of encounters of a short circuit, a sort of break, like the strike of beauty that suggests there's something more. It could be the conscious, the moral conscious that is broke that suggests something more. And then also this idea of there's some sort of short circuit. And if this short circuit is possible, this break in the system, quote unquote, and yet the world doesn't fall apart, then there must be something, dare I say, underneath or more fundamental that could allow the short circuit without the whole thing falling apart. But then the story emerges out of the exploration of the short circuit, per se. The mystery of beauty, conscious, moral consciousness, fall, irony, all of these different things. A component of this that I'm very interested in, that I'll bring in because Mr. Rivera has come in. Mr. Rivera and Aspasia noted that there seems to be some relationship between one's ability to articulate and what they find deep. So if you can't articulate much, a lot of people will say, oh, that's a deep poem, and that's it, right? They were talking about. I'm extremely interested in the mysterious relationship between the development of the subject and the ability to articulate. There's this idea that in the beginning, God is in the word, right? Well, does that, and if we believe that man is in the image and likeness of God, does that mean there is something about language that is in the image and likeness of man, and therefore one's ability to develop subjectivity is tied to actually language? And I think Aspasia, or music, and the Quran, deeper is music. There's something incredibly deep about music and language, right? So there are things there. And the reason I bring that up is because our capacity to enter or to know the story afforded by the short circuit may be tied to our ability to articulate. It may be tied to some sort of linguistical or language capacity that if we do not have, even if we experience the short circuit, we cannot experience it as an invitation to say the story of veiling or unveiling, the movement into the strike of beauty that follows the same Pascal logic, et cetera, so forth. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you today, sir.
Good to see everybody. It's kind of building this part. It's really interesting. A lot of times when Plato and Aristotle, they're citing poetry and works of literature all the time. It's meant to be actually the groundswell of their thought. Their process of investigation, of inquiry, is actually using the arts, poetry, legends, mythos, things like that, to discuss, to work through their accounts and philosophy. So on that kind of relationship of the depth of the author and what intention is, it almost seems like, and as you just said, Daniel, actually, this is why, I hold the stance a lot of that. This is from Aquinas too, the idea that knowledge, acquisition of knowledge is a transformation of the subject, is the soul. The soul is actually transformed in knowledge. So knowledge is not just a content gathering in the head. It's a complete reorientation of your patterns of perception, and actually be demonstrated by the depth of your account. That's the whole point. Is that the reason why I always talk about logos as accounts is because different logi add different penetrative depths to the same pragma, like the same content topic, the same thing of intent or awareness. The chemist has a way of talking about a piece of a candy that's different from a cook, for example, and that's different from. That's the thing that was very powerful about poetic interpretation. It's basically this interpenetrative, both they can go into the candy itself as an individual object, how it's composed, how it's arranged, how it looks, or it can be the relation about it, what it's to signify, all this, basically all the semiotic properties. And I think especially in the works of poetry, when they're done very well, they have one aspect we talk about is, I have a lot of interest in this because it overlaps with visual design. A lot is concision, the presentation of simplicity that is actually incredibly depth, has incredible penetrative depth at the same time. So it allows actually on one domain a very surface understanding that actually does not destroy, does not do any, that, but yet with awareness becomes has, for those who are unaware, as you said, the unconscious, who don't have the accounts, they have a drawing to it, they have a inclination about it, but they don't know why. But for those with accounts, they understand the deeper penetrative significance. And the best works of art have that quality. The fact that philosophers will point to art and artworks and things of the poetic experience or artifacts as almost inquiries of life. That there are these fonts of basically understanding that's possible, drawing out, because they have in one pairing a simplicity about them that also has a deeper reality available if we see it. I think about that a lot. I think a lot of it, and in an educational context, I think a lot of the training, I just got off a call about the content, the issue of explicit instruction versus inquiry, right? And there's some areas of legitimacy about this. For example, teaching fundamental skills in statistics or literacy in terms of phonics, things like that. It has been shown that it needs to be explicitly instructed. It needs to be done in a very directed, exterior, impositional way because they don't have the skill set. But then that's the problem. Then that's the general model of education is that. And it's that we don't have really a mature understanding of when it is we need to pivot to a more inquiry state where the initial presentation of giving people the accounts, giving them the equipment to then pursue accounts, to pursue inquiries, the next step. It's a very fine line. It's very difficult to understand that. But I definitely agree that we also can say that too, especially with the idea of the development of the subject because of the property of the phenonym, right? The idea that discourse does not necessarily have the content presented to you. There might be an unspoken premise behind it that's actually motivating and guiding and directing the entire discourse, the implications of it, or its meaning or significance. I find it interesting. Generally, a lot of scholars have had suspicion about the Greeks not having a kind of subjectivity, but I'm a little suspicious of that point because of the recognition by Aristotle in rhetoric about enthymeme meant he was very aware that there were unspoken premises in discourse. And also Plato's presentation of Socrates is incredibly ironic at many points of the converse. Irony is a mode of subjectivity because it's very much you're aware of the content, what you're saying. It's said in the oppositional state of what you're actually saying, as an example. But further in this point, one discussion of modernity has been this accelerational, the over acceleration of subjectivity, like with more basically recursive thought, basically, or recursive investigation or awareness. But yeah, I think that's what I could share.
Delightful. It does remind me of the great, Owen Barfield always makes this very interesting idea that language and therefore works like poetry, literature, et cetera, so forth, are sort of artifacts of subjectivity. And if you see changes in how people use language, this suggests transformations in how people qualitatively experience the world. And I'll give it to Mr. Rivera here. And so there's something very interesting as well, where if Mr. Barfield is correct, that there is something about studying literature and poetry, and that actually says something about the way people experience the world. Because there's always this problem. We say, how do we access the conscious experience of ancient man? How do we experience what it was like to be someone born in 1850 or whatever? How do we do that? What's it like to be a bat or whatever? Hans Gadamer in Truth and Method say, well, we can get close to the horizon of different historic periods with the painting. If we look at the painting, that has a way to get us closer. But Mr. Barfield presents the poetic diction, literature as artifacts of consciousness. But of course, but here's the point. If it is the case that there is something about the use of language that becomes evidence of how human beings experience reality, is it the case that it goes both ways? That is a certain feedback loop. And if you have a people that are not actually able to think poetically, you can have devolutions, perhaps. It's an error to suggest that evolution means improvement. People point that what is evolutionary is always context related, et cetera, so forth, and what is advantageous in X is not in Y, so one has to be careful about that. But there is a kind of idea that language, the modes of subjectivity are not simply recorded by the way that we use language. It may be that the way that we use language also determines the subjectivity by which we can use, which brings me to what Mr. Rivera was saying with Aspasia, on this idea that today there is something about if one's capacity to enjoy poetry or literature or words is actually tied to your own ability to articulate. And if you cannot articulate, then you really, all you can say is that's good or that's deep. You can't host a conversation about it, and therefore you can't create an orbit around it. And if you can't create an orbit, it can't be a participation that feels like a movement toward the beautiful, as maybe a DC Sendler, et cetera, so forth, would talk about. Which then begs the question of what does one lose if one does not do poetry or write or so on and so forth, right? What is lost in that? And if that is all so, then the ways that we are using language are actually going to truly color how we experience reality, not simply describe reality. It is not simply going to be decorations, but it is going to be the very channels by which thought is possible. And Aspasia, good to see you. I was just mentioning your talk with Mr. Rivera was wonderful. on language. And I guess the other thing that is very important to me is if you try to write a poem or you try to write literature, you have the very mysterious experience of finding yourself looking for words. I do wonder if you can have the experience deeply of the oddity and strangeness of looking for words if you don't try to write them, and try to write them and really capture what you're saying. The reason why I think the experience of looking for words versus just using words is very important, which can come out in literature and can come out in poetry, is because looking for words then makes them, there's suddenly a mystery, right? There's some sort of mystery you're after. You're looking for the mystery. You're looking for the beautiful. You suddenly see language as something that's not merely at hand, but has to be worked toward. And how can that be? How can it be that you have to look for words within yourself? Shouldn't everything within yourself be available? How can you contain something that is not available within yourself? That doesn't seem to make much sense. But once you try to write something and find yourself looking for words, this arises to you as a possibility, which then, of course, could perhaps invite you into activities that could develop you as a subject.
I do have to go. But yes, I like this distinction that you're making between using words and looking for words. I think a lot of the poetic experience is exactly that. You're looking for words. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain exactly how that goes about in my experience. But at least in my experience, it's kind of like it's waiting. You're waiting. I would say you're waiting. There's a lot of silence, walking around, looking, paying attention, and being open, right? I guess we can talk about the attributes of what it means to look for words instead of using them. But I'll leave it there. All right, I have to go.
No, thank you, Mr. Rivera. I appreciate it. And if this is so, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber and whoever else wants to speak, that if Mr. Barfield is correct, that there is something about language that are artifacts of subjectivity, and say the poem is a result, because I don't think good poems, certainly, although, of course, the word good can be an assessment that sounds judgmental, but if you grant it for me, because I don't think it's purely arbitrary, then this becomes a product, a certain spilling, a certain leftover of how a people looked for words, how a people tried to find a way to articulate reality, which, as Mr. Luber has put in the comments, I do think the effort to articulate is tied to an effort to relate to things, to establish relationships. Like, it's just very interesting because much of life, like when you read books and stuff, you go, oh yes, it like resonates with you. It's funny because a lot of good books don't necessarily say something you didn't know, but it articulates it in a way that now you feel like you have a grasp on and you understand it. It makes you feel like you can relate to the intuition. Before, the intuition was floating. You intuited this idea the book puts forth, but it was kind of floating. But once you get an articulation, now you can relate to it. It kind of brings it down. And it's interesting to think of words and vowels, right? Like, it's one thing to say that you love someone and something else to commit your life to them, right? That to make a kind of vow. And isn't it interesting that vows often are tied to language, putting something into words in front of other people before a community, right? And it's almost like when you have these deep intuitions of something, you go around looking for an articulation by which to actually create a certain commitment to that intuition and to actually make it real to you, and then something you can hold on and feel like you're not going to lose. And you can now assume it as a certain stepping stone for further steps. It can be a rung on a ladder for further climbing that without you couldn't have made that motion. So there's some sort of groping and seeking for relationships with phenomenon. The question also then becomes the following. If when you're, and perhaps this would be what Mr. Heidegger did before I give it to Mr. Luber, is if you read poetry or literature or philosophy, and there seems to be in the articulation a way of relating with things that we have now lost, must you recover all ways of relating to things in the past in order to relate to things well now? Like, it has to subsume everything that came before it. And if you don't subsume everything that came before it, you may get stuck in an unconscious, a pattern that you can't escape from, an entrapment, like we were saying, that then moving forth cannot occur. Of course, we know in Hegel that one only can advance into the future by knowing the past. You have to go to the past to go forward because you hit the wall, right? And so likewise, in the same way that there's this need to return to the past, to move to the future, to actually subsume or to sublate what was lost, I think basically what, if we take Mr. Barfield correctly, a similar thing applies to the arts. That you see in arts ways of experiencing, ways of relating, ways of qualitatively taking in reality that if are lost, then develop pathologies, but if are regained, make possible sublations into different forms of experience, which, if better or worse, depend on what we do with that capacity. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
I don't even know where to begin. Okay, first with the Heidegger thing, I think, actually, no, I want to start with Korbosky because that paper is still ringing in my head. He's basically talking about how if we get rid of is, we open up a new way of relating. Is holding a certain tyranny. And he makes this distinction with time and space, and it helps bring out a different way of approaching how to communicate. With that being said, language, I think, is used in a certain, the concept of language is used as a tyranny right now, where I think language isn't as, I think it's more niche than how people talk about it. So language, to me, like body language, I think should have its own name. Like it's a different, it's just different than language. And I think like with what Heidegger does, for example, he, and Javier pointed this out too, like he kind of overlooks the body a lot in a lot of his analysis. And what he tends to do is he finds a relation with a word in its etymology, and then finds when there's a deviation in its own etymology. So like, for example, with like, he does like with building and dwelling, for example, he finds in the etymology of, can't even say it in German, but like building, that there's dwelling and that it starts to mean different things. And that we lost what it means to dwell because we don't know how to build. And that's what he does, but there's no body there. But he's finding a relation nonetheless. I think my point here is just that relation is a universal way of describing what we're talking about, but how many different modalities relation falls into is combinatorially explosive. And like, because that's the case, we need to have different names for different domains in which relation relates in that domain. So like with language alone, and language in the strict sense I'm using it, words, there with Korbosky, he just shows that even within the language in that strict sense, there's so many different ways to relate. And then here's the crazy thing that I'm realizing. In these different modes of language, like we got the Korboskian mode of language, let's say, and then we have the normal colloquial is mode of language, they provide different applications, and all a different application ends up being is just a way of designing, constructing via a different relation. Like that's all it is. So, oh, before I forget, so like I was saying to Bard on the email thread, and if he listens, like I hope he like talks back to me, which I'm sure he will if he hears it. But like basically, he talks about object-oriented ontology as non-relational. And I was saying how like metaphysics is just relationship, is just relation. I was doing that move because I really do believe everything is relation. I kind of have to, it's part of the premise to what theme is, basically. And he was saying that's not the case. And then he was talking about object-oriented ontology. I took a quick glance at it, not really sure. Got to look deeper, to be honest. But the way he's talking about it is, I don't know if it is relation first with him. I just wanted to say that before. That was my second point from earlier. There's so many things that go in my mind on these nets, and it's hard to write it down when you're walking a dog. But I'll just say back to monkey mind over here. Basically, I'll just say back to what I was saying is like, I think like poetry is just a mode that helps you realize what I'm saying. Like, in terms of language, I think the game becomes interesting when we have these technological advances and we have these different modes of what physicality is. Like, oh, there's chips in human brains. Like, the human being, if we take seriously that we are just about relation and that's it, then our job, to me, isn't just to like write poetry. Like, if it was just like to write and to read, at a certain point in repetition, we kind of just become, robots of just reading and writing. But I think if you read and write like to the level like what you do, Daniel, it doesn't become like this automation. It just becomes part of relation for you. It's just a subsect of you relating. But it's not what makes up the relation of you relating as a whole, if that makes sense. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to have what it means to have a body is going to change, and we're going to have to figure out how to genuinely relate to it and not have this like fake subjective relation to it. And it's gonna happen with language. We just have to take serious the art of relating, and that just sounds so broad. And the second you specify what that means, you're just putting it within a domain, and it's delimiting the other possibilities of how relation can express itself. That's like the trick to. That's the hard part to it. So the name of the game is like, sure, learn to read and to write, but not for the sake of learning simply to read and to write. It's learning to relate. And then when you really get a grip of that, you don't necessarily have to read and write, because you might be able to just, once in a blue moon, read something and be able to relate to it because you have a deep, ability to relate at that point, essentially. So I think it's like, the name of the game is, how do we relate without making it too automatic, without, for you to relate, you have to read and write a lot. It has to be that plus more, like, or it's something more foundational, something more foundational, which I'm not sure what it is, but yeah, I just wanted to say that.
No, magnificent. I really appreciate that. Well, there's a few things that come to mind. First off, as we've spoken about before, and Michelle brings up with the bird story example that I think is very important. There's a big difference between gripping a pen. There's a big difference between never having a pen at all. And there's a big difference between having a pen you let go. The claim of annihilating is that you read a lot to let it go. And that the subject that lets go their reading and writing, lets go those big others, is different than the subject that never reads and writes at all, or the subject that is overly possessive of those things, right? Because there's a certain confidence and also trust in something beyond these things, that you needed these things to let go to actually make you beyond them. Because simply saying, oh, life is more than reading and writing is different than doing reading and writing and letting it go. Right? One could think of the logic of sacrifice, and yet it is not sacrifice for sacrifice's sake. It's for the work that it does on the subject that changes how they relate with the world and other people, right? And so there's this letting, as Mr. Wynn may say with Heidegger, annihilating, in negation of the negation, etc. That seems to be extremely important. But then there also seems to be truth to the idea, as Aspasia was saying with Javier, that there is something about the lack of an ability to articulate that then makes one unable to relate to poetry, unable to say why it is deep. And I would also argue
perfectly.
Oh, did I vanish? I vanished. Oh gosh,
he's back.
Gosh, it vanished. Oh, that's funny. One of the chipmunks is taking out the router or different things. Oh, this is fun. Are we having a net day where the internet is bad? Yep. So we were saying something about articulation. So yeah, there's this, I don't know if we heard it, but like Aspasia and Javier were talking about one's capacity to articulate being tied to, your ability to say this is a good poem or not, or is this good language, or so on and so forth. So it seems erroneous to say there's no value at all in reading and writing, but it also seems to say that it seems erroneous to say that the point is reading and writing, right? Because that seems to risk idolatry or different things. Like Mr. Barfield talks about isness being a form of idolatry because you're saying things are the ground of their own being, right? And Korobowski with identification is basically saying something similar, where if we have an ontology of idolatry, quote unquote, then we actually end up with mental health problems and different things, right? But there's something about reading to let it go that affords you different relationships. But it also seems like if you actually gain capacities of articulation, but don't bring them into action or bring them into relationships with people, that actually that capacity may destroy you. You may just have like a great inner capacity that's never filled with anything, so it becomes a giant void. It's like I like to say with Dante, where the higher you climb in the Paradiso, the more capacity you have, which actually means if you fall, the lower the level of hell, because now there's greater emptiness. It's a taller glass of water, so if you dump it out, there's more empty, right? So there seems to be something about doing the work of gaining capacity that's really important. But as you do that, there's greater risk. And perhaps the modern world has said that risk isn't worth it. So we just won't do. We'll just be happy with the simple language. We'll be happy with simply, being able to say that's cool or something like that, right? Well, that's all good and well, unless there is something about the political, economic, and social condition today that will prove pathological and fall apart unless we gain those abilities of discernment that we need, right? That there could be a massive problem going on. And this is where I hope the internet doesn't randomly die, but I have no idea. So, this is fun. But I'll give it to Mr. Luber here in a second. The other thing I wanted to point out is Tim Adlin at VoiceCraft was having a tremendous conversation with Todd. And one of the things Todd was talking about is AI is frictionless, and more people are actually opting for a relationship with AI because it won't judge me, it won't hurt me, it will accept me for who I am. And really, if a day arises, as Todd was pointing out, if AI can write short stories as well as people, if it can be romantic with you and so on and so forth, why bother with people? Why would you even bother to go into the realm of friction with human beings, right? Why would you even do that? Well, I think it's going to be very important that there's something afforded to us by human relation that cannot be found in any other kind of relation, like the AI or something like that. It's going to be very important, and I think that's going to be tied to experiences of beauty, experiences of conversation, experiences of unveiling that seem to bring out a certain infinity of relating. I guess what I want to say, as you were pointing out, is Korobowski, yes, once you move beyond isness, there's a kind of infinity of possible relations that are open to you, which one could overwhelm you like a Lovecraft creature. That could overwhelm you. Mr. Sweeney, always a pleasure to see you, sir. Thank you for stopping in. And so if you remove identification, then you could be overwhelmed by all of the possibility. But it would seem as if AI as a kind of forcing function is actually saying, no, we're going to have to actually go in and take that risk. We're going to have to face the Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses and learn the skills to actually deal with all those infinite relations and find it exciting. And I think that is honestly the creative mode, the poetic mode, the mode of being that sees things more creatively, which I actually would say also with object-oriented ontology, it's kind of interesting because have not poets for a very long time actually been in the business of trying to describe trees and things in a new way so that you see them for the very first time. Perhaps there's an issue where object-oriented ontology is a philosophy meant for a poetic language. And if you don't have that poetic language, then there can be issues. But if you do have it, then there's perhaps some realization. But I often do think about how there's something about poetry that has an object-oriented ontology, but it doesn't lose sight of the relationship and the person involved. But let me give it to Mr. Luber here, and Aspasia, thank you for stopping in. It's a pleasure. So Mr. Luber, please.
Per usual, I had a thought and then say something interesting. So the storytelling in AI, basically AI, to me, they're very good at maintaining a short circuit. But the human being can go deeper in the short circuit to that non-rational domain and then break up that short circuit into other possible short circuits that have always been within that short circuit. Now the question is, are we able to do that because we have a relation to excess? Is that why? Because if that is the case, then it might be possible for AI to have a relationship to excess relating to when can AI just let beings be? Because that's all it is just having a relation to excess. Now, I don't know if that's all it is. I think we'll be surprised that it's not just excess, it's excess plus, which is, I don't know what that plus is, but my gut feeling is that it's not just excess. Because I have to think about that a bit more before I talk more. But the other thing that I wanted to say with what you're saying is you're making me think of your conversations with Studebaker, which are unbelievable. You guys need to talk more, for real. He's great at communicating thoughts. He's really, really good at it. And it's like fucking gold. So yeah, you guys got to keep doing that. But you're just making me think, which you've been saying basically this whole time, but it's another epiphany. Aha! Oh, I now realize the question of participating in government appropriately, like not seeing Trump just as like some fool per se, getting into some short circuit narrative, is to always be in touch with the excess in another way. Always having this like ontological relation at the forefront, because what you do is you don't, any position that's thrown out there, you try to see how that changes the landscape. You see it as more than just a proposition. You see it as now part of the field of possibilities that shape the landscape. And how to think through that is to be a genuine participant in politics. And we lost that. And that's just because, for whatever reason, coming from the academic level down, we do not take relational ontology seriously. Like that's all it is. It's in a funny way. I think it starts in the academic world where there isn't a relation as what is metaphysics. I really do think there should be a tiering of that, because it's like kind of a trick. It's like, oh yeah, okay, that's such a simple statement, but like if you really think about it, relation takes crazy shapes and forms that you can never think, but they're always relation based. So and this goes back to the whole past net, where we want to have a flattened relationship with content. Call it poetry, call it writing Substack, brilliant Substack articles, because that article was great that Ebert put out. I thought that was like so helpful. Like, so like anybody that doesn't think that's helpful, I'm like, do you really know what he's saying then? Like, it's like, I agree with him. It's not on him. It's really not on him. It's a shame that I'm curious what the non-watered down version of that is. For real. But so just that, how do we, I think what will happen is, and this is kind of like a Nick Landian move a little bit, which is we kind of got to lean into the flatness. We got to not keep making just flat content, but making flat content that allows the possibility to see excess in it, to break out of that flat content. So like it's within flat content itself that will escape flat content. And this goes back to like the Heidegger saying, where it's like, where danger grows, so does its saving place. It's within the concept that you break out of the concept. It's not, oh, let's break out of the concept by putting another concept on top of it. Because ironically, you're gonna not do what your plan is, and you're actually gonna be more stuck in the initial concept that you're trying to break out of. So I think it's like, how do we configure flat content in a way and make people think of ways of creating content that isn't flat, that's based off the very flatness in which inspired them. That's the trick. And And I just got to say on the side note, I'm fucking hyped to write these stories with you and Jockin. I just got to say that. I'm fucking juiced up, ready for that. Nobody probably knows what I'm talking about, but you'll see one day. But yeah, I'll pass it off.
Magnificent. Well, I'm excited as well. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin here. I think this idea of finding in the concept itself what breaks out, that's exactly right. As we were speaking with Studebaker, if you are simply trying to find some sort of revolution against capital, revolution against anything, you just get absorbed into it. Instead, what you want to do is find, well, the question, obviously, as we talk about all the time in economics, is how do you create demand if you just don't conflate that with stimulating demand? Demand is what makes capital possible in capital. And if you actually home in on that, you unleash that logic that requires the human element, the relation of human to the system. You then focus on that as an engine of wealth creation, which I think is pointed to by the solo residual. And then in a way, you're making capital more capital than even itself, by actually becoming more focused on human well-being and wealth, right? Because there's also just a massive problem to suggest that the pricing mechanism in capitalism did not improve well-being for human beings. It's gotten countless people out of poverty, right? Running water, food, et cetera, so forth, right? The issue is that capitalism then tends to, by its own efficiency and success, conflate the categories of creating demand with stimulating demand, and it starts solving problems that it creates within its own logic, as opposed to problems that humans face that they need the pricing mechanism and capital to help address. Therefore, people's problems become the problems the machine wants to solve. People therefore outsource the work of human to the machine, and you get the replacement of humanity versus the extension of humanity. But that is not because the capital mechanism itself is quote unquote evil or unusable. No, it's simply being fed a demand that is of a flattening that creates a flattening versus a demand that creates more dynamicism, more drive, more creativity, and more human being, right? So how do you change what people demand, what people want to do? And Studebaker and I were talking about that a lot. So likewise, how do you get people to see within the flatness the girdle point, or within the flatness the space where a strike of beauty is possible, within the flatness a place where the failure of the object actually says, hey, if desire always fails, maybe that's because the mechanism that creates desire is supposed to be sublated into drive or intrinsic motivation, because it's supposed to be an ever orbiting of the beautiful, right? Well, that can be experienced in flatness. That can be experienced in the system, not by leaving it. The moment you say, well, we got to get people out of the system to see the shortcomings of the system, you're doomed. That's not going to work. Right? And that's where you get, like Studebaker has talked about, so many more progressive-minded people are in ideology critique. They say, well, the only reason you think that way is because you've been brainwashed by the ideology. The only way you think that capitalism actually has gotten millions of people out of poverty is because you've been brainwashed by capitalism. What about all the people that it's enslaved in third world nations and so on and so forth? The problem is that's ever deconstructive, and you never can go anywhere, right? And so you get the what Foucault and them talked about as the barbaricism of refinement, right? You just the problem is rationality can deconstruct forever if you're not careful. Like, it can always cut something, and eventually you have nothing left. So, Mr. Luber, thank you for being here, sir. So you have to keep rationality from doing that, which means you have to bind it. Well, how do you bind it? This was important for Foucault and all of the people of the modern counter-enlightenment. Well, you have to, for one, assume the thing that you are immanent with. You have to assume the system you're in. Like, you have to assume the ground of what's there, and you have to think its own logic. If you say, well, we need to get outside of it, you got the barbaricism of refinement, and you're doomed, right? You have to look for what is in what is there that can be brought out to unveil new possibility. That is what good fiction does. That is what good art does. It's a certain training in that way of thinking. And if people aren't trained in that way of thinking, they probably will not have the way of thinking to do everything we just described. All they can maybe do is problem solve. But the problem solve is going to be necessarily according to the logic of what's immanent. So it would not be bringing out the potential within the immanent if you start poking on it, right? Because that's more of an artistic and creative mindset. So again, if people's relation to language, as Aspasi and Javier were saying, if people's relationship to art has shifted, that might suggest a loss of capacity to do the things that we are describing. But I appreciate what Mr. Luber was saying, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
I mean, to build on that, Daniel, I mean, before the glitching, freezing episode occurred, I did want to share your note about this relationship of your depth of account as a kind of articulation with a kind of draw a commitment, a combining or a union of capture, a kind of a gathering with existence, experience, and life. I think it's very important because I think about this because this idea, its relationship to the poetic experience, the intimacy and the erotic, in the sense of this kind of interpenetrative descriptional awareness, right, is the exact opposite of the kind of cognitional abstraction, right? That's kind of, in terms of its polar opposite. I think the art trainings, as I do with my students all the time, is that when we move from I like it or that's fine or I don't care, is a general sense, like these, that's a sign of lack of depth of communication, that they're not in that, the sign of showing the difference is when we have a deeper understanding of ability to articulate. And actually, ironically, almost actually through the act of articulation, you get more excited about it or more interested about it because we kind of realize that life's interesting inherently. Like, I think people kind of realize that when they actually get penetrated with a life in a very deep way. And what you're hinting at about kind of working through an account to draw out a distinction or a break relates to a conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about dreams, right? In the sense of dreams being a transformation of what was once impossible, what is completely impossible and childish, to an inevitable possibility, right? So these impossible hypotheticals become potential possibilities of almost inevitable nature. Again, flight is the most common example. Flight was considered this great fantasy of thought, of dreams for centuries, for millennium. And now it's just, and then after a certain point, it became now an issue of not if, but when. And then once that when, and that's where rationality does a really good job, is when rationality does an excellent job, the way you're talking, Daniel, of once we move from the impossible to possibility, it becomes now just a matter of optimizing, making it more effective, making it more safe, etc. Things like that. It does a great job. That's why flight now has become mundane. Of course, and that's always the catch, right? That's always the catch. The problem with all this is the transformation of the beautiful to the good, because that strike of insight with a deep penetration of life has now been kind of subsumed into desire. Always does seem to have a weird tension when especially unthought, right? It has that kind of dulling quality. I think like the sense of numbness. That's kind of ironically the sense, especially in this. Actually, I wish Lubu was here to talk about it. A sense of, in a condition of excess, of overstimulation, right? It kind of numbness is the response to that, and it actually deadens you in the sense of you're still. It's ironic because you're still aware of the good, like you're still oriented towards things you're desiring. That's true, but the affective state is one of a numbed overwhelm. I just find that interesting. And another angle about that, and I'm going to draw out what you're saying, Daniel, about working in a system to draw out a possibility, is the financialization of our language. What I mean by that is, if you notice in corporate culture, there's an entire way of existence that is to the fact that when we can make comedy about it. There's so many TikToks and Instagram things I've seen where people are like mimic, like interpretive dancing to circling back now. We want a good ROI on, like, and they're making fun of this language, and it's awesome. But see, the comedy is the terror, they're both realizing that this is how we're talking. And you notice this entire language is one of financialization. The abstractional, and this is actually why I note about the transformational quality of when we have this articulational account of penetration, of understanding, we go into the past to articulate our future. And that actually gives us orientation to the present. Do you realize what's happening? You know, for a long time, like I wrote some essays about this, about usury, right? The use of interest as financial and abstractional instrument. It does have it has this temporal quality to it. Now, does it not? Especially when it's borrowed money that you don't have. Leverage against what you have in the future. And you notice all this language in corporate culture is a financialization mechanism. And it's completely transformed, and almost everyone would agree has destroyed human existence. This is not life. I don't know. Now, I'd love to hear. I don't have strong comments about, or more refined points about that. But I want to make that observation of this is what I'm noticing is, what is that difference? Both are doing this operation, this kind of act of penetrative past into the past of experience to be captured into language, which then articulates our future. right? That doesn't have, it actually does as vivifying, has this vivifying quality of experience, versus this fractionalization language, the way we're talking about this, does the exact opposite. You see, like, see, that's it. See, for me, I'm just talking this through, and I'm kind of like stupefied of seeing a limit. I saw a pattern, I drew it out, and again, if other people resonate with this, I'd like to hear you talk about it. But I just want to share that note, Daniel, that this is coming from. I want to point out this came from you, Daniel, with your comment about this use of articulational language to get a deeper account of subjectivity, to capture to re-articulate and commit to the past, right, to life, basically, and reorient the future. That's all I got.
Brilliant. And again, I think the point you are making about in our language just seeing the tyranny of financial metaphors, et cetera, so forth, to me, that would, if I'm thinking Owen Barfield, 200 years in the future, people could look at our language and the way we use it and say, ah, yes, this was a society that was financial. Their subjectivity was captured by financial instruments because of the way that you see the language used. And that's, I think, a lovely, concrete way to get at what Mr. Barfield is saying. I think Mr. Barfield is actually saying many profound things because, first, the metaphors we use are not arbitrary. We tend to absorb them from the zeitgeist. We feel as if it's just random and we just picked it out of the blue. No, you just happen to pick 9 out of 10 a financial metaphor. That's not your own creative out of the blueness. It is because you've absorbed that zeitgeist, right? And that's something that Mr. Barfield would be pointing at. And also, he thinks you can take it deeper in the sense that language is a hint of the very way people experience the world. He thinks that in language, you see that when people experienced wind, as an example he makes, and they called wind spirit, that wasn't a metaphor. It literally was the case that wind was spirit. They were two sides of the same coin. It was not a metaphor. It was participatory. Of course, the wind blowing through the trees is not equal to spirit, but there is something participatory that is going on in what is occurring. There is a glimmer of the full reality in this material experience, and language was participation in that, not merely definitions, et cetera, right? And he thinks that the way people did poetry and that they wrote words suggested that. Obviously, the difference between Homer and the Torah suggests difference in psychology, as Auerbach famously makes in Odysseus' Scar. And actually, if you take Mr. Barfield seriously, all of literary criticism actually becomes a certain history or anthropology of subjectivity itself, not merely decorations and culture in a kind of nice way, but it becomes a certain deeper anthropology. Now, on what you were saying on economics, which I think is extremely important and extremely well put. So if we take seriously this, again, warning from Hegel, but I think many philosophers follow into this, where they said, don't think about the future so much. Think about the past to go into the future, right? You need to recover the past, interpret the past to move into the future. Usually we can't move into the future because we've misinterpreted something, right? I do think the beating heart of humanities in general, the humanities departments as a wing, as opposed to STEM, there is something about the humanities that is deeply connected with a certain calibration of a relationship to the past. And that there's a belief that if this relationship is wrong, it somehow has a big impact on the future, right? I think when I look at STEM, there's something about STEM that often is more kind of like, well, what is now? Like, what is now? Like, what are the facticities of now? What is the givenness by which we are asking questions about the past? And I think obviously physics asks questions, cosmology, and state how the universe came into existence. But there's something much more observation-based, obviously. And if it's observation-based, then it's more present-based, right? So we have humanities being present to past, generally speaking, STEM being a little more present to present. But then we have this question of future to present, which is dangerous because the moment you start assuming the future, you're automatically in the imaginary register. You're automatically imagining something, as a Lacan and psychoanalyst would say, which is dangerous because once you start imagining and determining the present, then it becomes pathological. It falls into various psychological issues and so on and so forth. And Michael, good to see you, sir. And so what we have is an economic system that seems to be mostly determining the present based on the future. So, for example, we are determining share prices based on projections of earnings that, of course, following the Buffett indicator is very far off. These projections are also tied to leverage, and leverage is incredibly dangerous. And leverage could blow up the bond market here because of the oscillation in the now, as we're seeing bond prices on the 10-year is switching so rapidly. People are talking, you may have heard it, it's more in the headlines now, of the basis trade, which is the idea that, when they're basically trading the 10-year against the futures. They know it's going to be sold, and in that divide, you can make some money. That they're now in that divide, in order to make a lot of money, you need to take 20 times leverage, right? Like big leverage, which is all well and good, unless there's a massive oscillation in the 10-year and you get a margin call, right? Margin calls cause massive systemic financial crises that could be truly unbelievably bad, right? But notice, all of this is only possible because of a certain logic of assuming what we should do in the present by a certain projection of the future, right? Like, you would never take a 20 leverage margin call on the bond market if you went, can we really assume the future? Can we really know what the future is going to entail? Can we do that? Likewise, stock, basically equities are primarily priced in future projections of cash flow. Like, what is the future value going to be, right? Well, then if there's suddenly a tariff war, trade war, turned out those futures were gone, click, 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 like falling down an elevator. And it turned out people's plans and futures were off, and then they're going nuts, and you have social unrest and different things, right? The point is the following, is that economics today is very much a future to present way of thinking. And the logic of economics is based on a certain relation to the future, right? STEM seems to be more present to present. Humanity seems to be past to present, right? I think there are many religious traditions that, and many philosophical traditions that would say the first two are okay, present to present, present to past. The one that gets you into danger is anytime you start going from future to present. That's when you're opening Pandora's box, because you have to be God to know the future, basically. And you, by definition, must be creating black swan situations. And I definitely think what we've basically done, and I'd be curious any response you have this to Mr. Jockin, because what I think you've said about basically the logic of economics being, in a way, the opposite of the logic of philosophy, or the opposite of this going to the past to get a better account to move into the future, would also suggest why there's something about economics that aligns with AI and artificial intelligence, because it doesn't need an account. It has its account, and it simply makes most effective and dominant that account that everything then has to conform to it. It leaves out the human, because the human is somehow tied to the very effort of new accounts, the very effort of new languages, and that all gets kicked out. And economics goes in this direction of future to present, which brings all of these massive systemic risks. But the wager is that, well, they're too bad to happen. Yeah, sure, we shouldn't do that. It creates all sorts of inefficiencies in the system, but the Fed will have to bail us out. The Fed will have to bail out the basis trade. So you have this idea of being, which of course creates moral hazard. And then, of course, what it does is, if there's something about the system that continues to be preserved, that then makes certain classes of people feel like they never have a chance because they don't own stocks, or they feel like they have jobs that are being offshored or something like that, then you get social unrest. So it is very interesting if economics, as a thought, and then if anyone has any thoughts on anything, if economics is evidence that when you start bringing the future into the present, you're risking systemic issues. And even if you, and this would be what, Keynes warned. He said, sure, okay, too big to fail. I guess that one guy calls it the dollar milkshake theory, where the dollar is basically too big to fail, blah, blah, blah. Keynes would say, okay, that may help you in economics, but economics is not separatable from politics or the society. And as you save the economy, if you do it in the wrong way, you could lead to social unrest, or lead to politics collapsing into something perhaps more tyrannical or more upset, and you get a systemic problem. So it's interesting to think, if economics is evidence that going from relating future to present is very dangerous and leads to systemic risk, versus present to present, or present to past. STEM, humanities, economics. I'm thinking of that logic that you're bringing forth, but let me give it back to you, Mr. Jockin.
No, that's good. That's good. And again, we're just talking. This is the raw stuff. This is the raw just because again,
Sure.
I presented a conundrum puzzle, and now we're talking through what are the implications of it. And I think immediately the problem I generally agree with you, Daniel, but here's the issue with that present to future. There are two problems, at least in my mind. One is the problem of what's called the prophetic sense or term tense. What I mean in religious, there are religious examples where the future is projected in the past. Like it's just like this future is projected into the present, and he is risen. It's a very famous example. There's other ones in Islam, in Quran as well. And also the idea that economia originally came from a theological account. Is my understanding of Christianity was the nature of providence. So basically, because God has a direct connection to history, it's pre-known by God and foreknowledge, but it has to be participated in and worked out. So, and Islam has similar positions or on aspects of that. So I think the issue of the future projected into the present, and especially in kind of eschatology about the expectation of the end times and what the signification will that be of a new future. So anyway, from the religious point of view of these Abrahamic religions, my understanding, there is a presentation of the future into the present, right? And also especially this idea of the creative activity of this transformational quality of seeing a new possibility, right? So this kind of language about that of when is that a complete disaster versus when is this a real spark of new activity, new life. And that's a big, I'm presenting this as an honest question because, generally this is also why like Heidegger's critique of technology has, you can make an argument that some critiques have been that there is no distinction. It's the same thing, that it's just been a process of being compressed into basically more and more progressively different degrees of standing reserve. Just in different, it's a difference of degree, not kind. Heidegger says, no, there is a difference. So I think there's some critique on that. For example, I mean, Plato's very, in Phaedrus, the whole critique against writing as basically the destruction of memory. And this kind of reminds your notes, Daniel, on that, and the Ivish, I can't pronounce his name, note about disablement, right? That technology disables as much as it almost like disables individuals, but gives the collective or the kind of aggregational set more capacity as a result. So I'm just bringing up this kind of projectional quality of the future does seem to have presence in other accounts, but there's something about financial transformation this way by a symbolic representation or quality that's in pure symbolism. That causes even more. It's all these extreme, exactly all these the margin calls, leverage, crazy leverage. I mean, come on. I've seen the memes of like, pay buy now, pay later. Your Uber Eats, going to Coachella, things like that, and it's like constantly the same memes are being shown of margin call or The Big Short, where people are just like, how much leverage are we putting down these burrito orders? Like that's these kind of memes coming up about it. Again, it's comedy, but it's actually pointing to a real reality of like financial. It's not even just software. The old line was software eating the world, but financialization is eating the world. I always think about actually, but on the note of history, again, I'm just riffing now. The fact that personal credit cards was not a real thing until 1980, 1990. Around that time period, like I was a child when it started coming up. Like that's so it's funny. Like like the Zoomers are all like everyone's like the Zoomers don't understand about the world before the cell phone, the iPhone. They had iPhones and iPads all their lives. That's isn't it kind of annoying? These kind of like off the cuff, obvious points of major cultural, social distinction, but no one's turning around saying, "Oh yeah, at one point, no one had this thing called credit cards, a personal credit card that didn't even exist. That did not exist. It was not a thing." Corporations had it. It was lines of credit originally. That's what it was. Anyway, so I'm just thinking about like notice what things are just obfuscated from not even being discussed. So I have to share those notes. That's all I have. Again, I'm very messy stuff, so I'm just throwing stuff.
I like messy. No, all those points are excellent. I'll give it to Mr. Parsons. I think what you're saying first, it's I think it's an excellent point on prophecy in religious traditions. I guess my first response would be there seems to maybe a way to put it is in prophecy, what happens in the future is outside of your control. It's something that's going to occur and God is the main agent and you trust in that. Whereas in these kind of financial things, you can use the future to take out debt. You can take on leverage, and it's more of you are an active agent. And maybe that actually points to the issue. If you're going to deal with the future, you better be God, right? If you're not God, don't deal with the future, because for God, the future is the present. So there's a weird way where it's not the future for God. You could play with that maybe. Although the point is, there's also something about prophecy only being understood within the acceptance of the tradition that is in the past now, right? Like you only get these prophecies of the future if you go back to the tradition in which that prophecy is found. So even the prophecy has a certain going back to it, right? And also anything in the tradition that points to a future state is out of your control, right? Now, obviously, when the people are alive and the prophecy first hits, that's a different story. But maybe there's also something here where the problem of thinking the future correlates with the technological state of your society. Like now, when you have really advanced technology and you can do things like financialization, leverage, and tanks, war, et cetera, so forth, then imagining the future is more likely to lead to a utopian project where you make everything worse. Whereas glimmers of the future 2,000 years ago perhaps would not so easily lead to utopian visions that would be destructive or financial carelessness that creates new dark ages or different things. So maybe there's something like that. Mr. Jockin, please.
I mean, just to add, this is part of Heidegger's critique, or just a Heidegger stance of his question of technology, is to say the difference is that totalizing quality, right? That when thought is said to be this totalizing system that everything is known, parameterized, and it will be just perfect. We just do X is very different from this kind of patch with Heidegger's point. The difference of the dam versus the watermill is that there's not this totalizing annihilation of the being of the things involved in it. At most, it's a synergetic cooperation, which is similar to basically how man is supposed to orient with God, is that we're supposed to work with God. Not command him, first of all. That's magic, so no go on that. You can't do that's the difference between magic and religion, is that magic commands by intention versus it's done with you, and you're basically, again, it's the watermill example. The watermill is not forcing the water to go, it just happens to be there at the same time, which is one of our qualities we talk about where synchronicity is on-cause connection. That's kind of an example of that. I just want to share those notes because I think I'm just responding.
I think that's outstanding. Very well put. And, I also think an argument can be made that and then I'll give it to Parsons, that some of the most problematic forms of, say, American Christianity have been based on some sort of assuming of what God's going to do, or a guarantee of what the future looks like, or taking the book of Revelation and creating the Left Behind series, where instead of going, okay, there are prophetic visions that point to possibilities in the future that we cannot know, but we hope in, we're not certain of, but there might be something there. When you move it into the, no, we have certainty about what God's going to do, then you seem to get all sorts of trouble, right? So there seems to be, the point you're making on prophecy is very strong. I think basically the prophecy and the history of religious movements around prophecy are evidence of the danger of thinking about the future. It's a very serious thing to think about the future. Like all of these end of times communities, all of these people that have formed different things. I mean, to think about the future, to mess with the future is very dangerous. And if you are going to do it, you are risking a lot. Which then, of course, if economics is doing a lot with the future and not taking it with a certain reverential fear, that's a bad combination. And I think you could argue that much of economics and its financialization is a certain messing with the future, not really taking seriously what you may be risking in doing if stuff doesn't go according to plan, which, the way they're talking with the tariff, like, oh, so you mean to tell me that Trump, if he not didn't put those other tariffs on a 90-day hold could have bankrupted the entire world? Is that what you're telling me? Really, one person. That's how fragile everything is, right? Okay. Did we really think, well, that could never happen? Well, it seems like it could, right? Now, whether that's right or wrong, whether tariffs are good or not, as I spoke with Studebaker about, that's a different question. But the point is, there's a certain danger of using the future or thinking the future, right? That doesn't mean one never does it. And one also has to ask, what is the difference of imagining creative possibilities versus planning the future? There seems to be also differences between that. Like, we're going to plan what the future is going to be and we're going to design the future, as opposed to imagining possibilities of what we could do now that open up a new future. There does seem to be a difference between that, planning the future, and what can we do today that may open new possibilities in the future that we cannot know. Those tend to be different minds. But of course, that's the difference between prepare and plan that we talk about with Mr. Illick. But let me give it to Mr. Parsons. Mr. Parsons, it's a pleasure to have you today, sir.
Great. Yeah, great. Guys, some ideas coming between you and Jockin. Just this future projection, I keep thinking of, like, with the prophecy and with that, it seems like that's where excess comes in. We're trying to get out ahead of our skis in a way, and it always tends to be problematic but it's almost like we're, again, using just the system we have here, the language we have here, and like this the traps of the language. I keep thinking of, like, how our language now, we're trapped in financial language. We refer to ourselves in, like, economistic language, or how am I going to be today? I'm not going to be any good today, and objectifying ourselves. But it makes me think too, like, almost in a sense, like, we have to use this, like, the excess we're trying to use, because we are trapped in this kind of spiraling downwards. And if we don't, that's where, like, you tend to do better when, like you're saying, Hegel uses the past and the failings and the breakdowns to stimulate, maybe coming to terms with the problems we're in now. But most of the times, like you're saying, we don't. The system and the language we're using now is trapped, so it then tries to use excess in a way to get out ahead of itself, but then it finds itself back in lack again when something like the tariffs or whatever takes place. And then, but in a sense, like, we could use the tariffs, one man taking down the world economy, as an eye-opener. Like, we can't let that happen, so what do we do about that? You know what I'm saying? If we were to face that. But in our culture war, it doesn't seem to be used in that way. It's used as a tool to attack again. And but maybe that's because our language doesn't, we suffer from the ability to where I think even around the turn of the century, maybe a coming together or a problem like that might be more, they may have the ability to use that to get somewhere with it. But I'll stop with that. I was just going off those ideas.
Well, I think that's very well put. Well, I think what also it's making me think, and then if anyone has any final things, I've enjoyed it. If we don't have capacities, or we don't believe in new human capacities, which, as we spoke of earlier, seems to have something to do with our relation to language. Poetry, Owen Barfield, which teaches us, when we try to search for words versus just use words, and thus we become a mystery to ourselves, and thus we begin exercising the possibility of new capacities. If we do not have any of that, then it would seem as if the likelihood of us getting ahead of our skis is higher. Like, because we can't do anything now, right? There are no new capacities. We feel like we're stuck, right? Well, then all we can do is kind of try to design a different future, or force a different future, or try to escape the immanent logic of the system, or deconstruct and tear down, right? So the willingness of one to tarry with the negative and stay in the present and try to and make sure we don't get ahead of our skis seems tied to our relation To the degree that we believe there are human capacities that can be cultivated, which one's belief in that possibility seems to be tied to the relationship to the humanities, or seems to be deeply influenced, right? Once you learn that language can afford different ways of talking, different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing the world, and you've actually experienced yourself gaining new internal capacities, not merely external skills to get a job, well, then it doesn't seem crazy that there might be something that we can do to make a difference based on focusing on opening up capacities now. But if you have a society that doesn't do that, which based on Aspasia and Javier's talk, there's reason to think, and I think there is reason to think, then I think the temptation to get ahead of our skis is higher. I think our likelihood to jump to the future is higher because that seems to be our only hope. It's an act of desperation, because we feel kind of repressed, right? Like we lack capacity. We want to do something. You feel kind of held back, right? And in that sort of state, I think it is much more likely that out of desperation, we get ahead of our skis. Or the other thing is we just say, we'll blow it all up and see if something good comes of it, right? If you don't believe in human capacities, then, taking a gamble seems when all you have is a gamble or death, the gamble is hope. And the likelihood of that situation being so, I think, of us believing that is an accurate description of the present moment seems strongly tied to our belief in human capacity, which again, if we don't read poetry, if we don't relate to philosophy, if we don't get taken in by the mystery of language, it seems much more likely we lose hope in. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin before we bring it to a close. Mr. Jockin.
Excellent conversation. I like the angle. I get your point about when we don't think of any other possibilities, we just say, well, it's either we're going to just throw to the chance and see what happens and hope it works out. There is an issue of courage, though. What about the times of intuition where it takes a brave, dramatic act of not having certainty that I know what's going to happen, but I'm willing to take the risk, especially in the face of uncertainties of lack of social recognition, lack of confirmation that this will succeed, etc. That's the area, which is interesting. One of the critiques positing for the benefit of capitalism is that the abstractional structures of capitalism permit risk taking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Dana, obviously, the comment that it can be challenged that basically now you cannot succeed economically unless you risk take. Well, the counter argument is being made is to say, well, no, that's actually that's the point. It's working because we need to risk take. And actually, the problem is that we're not financially literate enough to know about financial instruments that will allow us to be risk takers and not be directly at risk. You can make that would be like the rhetoric discourse between the two parties on that point. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the tension, though. So that's the thing is that naturally, to be human is to err. If I quote that, if I kind of play with that line, and one part of that is it takes us. Creativity does require kind of have an orientation of risk taking. Does seem to be necessary at one point or juncture. That's the tension. But yet we feel like when it's presented in this way that basically psychological subjectivity capture, kind of again like capital realism, where there's not our language has been so captured by this account of financialization and everything's been permeated by it. Is that that's the real language of reality? Everything else is just secondary. I think also, to be fair, even you can make a critique against STEM on this in the sense of their presumption that they take for granted their methods of knowing. They take it for granted. They don't. It's not, again. It's a kind of, certainly now oriented. And actually, the problem. Actually, I'll generally say, I always joke around about this, is that humanity papers, we're talking about Plato, Aristotle, Al-Ghazali. So any of these the Iliad, they get to exist and persist. So I could read a paper, from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and actually get a lot of benefit from it. Actually get more value if you start looking back. How did Hume talk about this? Look at this. How did Aquinas think about this text? That commentary aspect of understanding gets more value the longer time period you have. It's like the Lindy effect. It's basically it's a motive of Lindy effect versus empirical studies that are basically disposable. They're perishable. They can be outdated, can be completely outdated by more research that invalidates the original hypothesis, or there's an error in the research methods we found out. right? There's application errors, things like that. So I would not hold STEM away from this critique. They are kind of getting stuck in it too. At the same time, the finance does not get a privileged position of somehow being completely not in the wrong, but like having this problem that we're talking about with this kind of a failure of imagination. I think it is, and it's relation. It's both in their relationship to the past. I agree, but then what I'm point of making up is that the humanities does seem to have a role to play in orienting the future. It does, but yet I don't think I'm clear yet what that is or how to disentangle it from these other dimensions we're talking about.
Magnificent. I agree with all of that. For me, if the humanities are healthy and are in a dialectic with the STEM, then STEM does not come to do our metaphors for us and therefore frame us in a way that leads to reductionism. I suppose I want to say that STEM is less likely to get into a sort of global, systematic, financial black swan, right? Like in order to do that, it seems like you're getting into, well, giant systems, right? Like science and economics, of which, by the way, can be influenced by a STEM that metaphorically makes them think a way that leads them into that direction. But it would seem as if economics is what starts creating all of these interconnected networks and so on and so forth, of which, again, that doesn't mean STEM. I guess what I want to say is I don't see STEM as on its own being capable of correcting those excesses that you see, say, in economics. I completely agree with that. And then you have to have the humanities to keep that from occurring. But I am wondering if there are differences in that can be traced to the way that the field relates to the future and what it is able to do at scale in relation to the future, where, you know, economics can take out on margin debt things that if the banks go under will affect people that have nothing to do with economics, right? Like just farmers Joe down the street, right? Government could take the technology of STEM, like the nuclear bomb, and affect Farmer Joe down the street, who has nothing to do with it, right? Or they can use the technology of STEM to have great systemic impacts. But it would seem as if science needs to be connected with that great central power to have those gigantuous systemic black swan events. Whereas the STEM laboratory, it may train the individual scientist into a relation to subjectivity that is very reductionistic and very problematic. But in order to have these kind of fast spreads to the society, it seems like it gets connected with more of a power structure. But let me give it to you, Mr. Jockin.
One thing I want to just kind of reply back to that is the problem of iatrogetics in the sense of when now you can make an argument this is economically driven, but it's also internally in the logic of research that they will optimize for some good that's known, and then it causes all these negative side effects that were that were unknown at the time, and then they explode. The most famous example is that more medicine meant for morning sickness for women, right? It was meant to help treat, and very clearly, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that was designed, right? The only problem was that it was actually very important, was that they didn't even realize the chiral property of molecules. It was really fast. Unfortunately, that's how it was actually that thing. It was actually a known property before. I wrote a Substack about this months ago. I actually got curious. I researched it. It was discovered in the 1800s, right? The chiral structure of molecules, where the the idea of a left-handedness and a right-handedness to molecule structures matters. That, or better say, it was acknowledged that existed, but it did not matter. It was like basically a lack is not. It was an empty category. It was like, yeah, that exists, but who cares? Until guess what? We found out that in terms of that morning sickness treatment medicine, the chirality of the molecule actually really matters. Left hand, you get all the good properties you want with no damage. The right-handed, disaster, causes the birth defects and everything else. So there was a category that was nothing. Was really a lack the whole time. It actually very much had an effect. We just were not aware at the time what that was. So I would actually, I don't know, man. I'm very critical of this. I think my critique holds down to them too, to science research. Like because of points like this is clearly a huge problem of their accounts just will not, if it doesn't meet their certain criterion of analysis of what they're investigating, it will be a nothing. not a lack. And as a result, it's almost guaranteed that some disaster will show up in the future.
Oh, I don't disagree with any of that. I guess I would wonder if the flexibility or the willingness of science to correct its mistakes or acknowledge its mistakes is tied to if a company's making money off of it, if future earnings projections are tied to the research, and also if they have governmental power to shut down counter research, right? Like that also seems to be tied. There's no doubt at all that science can cause these very, very big problems that can spread. I'm wondering if the institutions that are able to, that are very concerned about the future or their systemic health in the present is tied to future cash flows, projections into the future, stockholder value, then leads to a killing of the flexibility or the correction mechanisms of science. Now, of course, Firebind and all of them certainly point out that the scientific consensus is no sainthood. People are hiding their results, hiding what the things they want to say, and et cetera, so forth. But once you get the involvement of central power or big corporations that have a vested interest in what the results are, the likelihood of those STEM problems not being corrected or spreading or getting worse and worse, and the egotism of scientists not being forced to be created by the negativity of the outcome grows higher. So I don't disagree with anything if you're saying. I would actually say, like, there is certainly a potential negativity in STEM. I guess all I would say is that central power, which again, I do associate with the capital nation state of Koratani, multiplies that negativity and makes it much harder to correct. But then on the flip side, I want to say that the tendency of the humanities that isn't in a conversation with these three is to fragment into internally consistent systems and conspiracies that don't relate with one another. So atomization, the humanities tend to go in an atomizing direction, where the other two tend to go in a centralizing direction. And maybe this is the way we can put it. The degree that centralization is likely to be very pathological and problematic is tied to the degree that it has a relation to the future where it is assuming it for the present, like shareholder value, equity, margin, et cetera, so forth, right? That's where then it's expanding its power by basically colonializing the future too. Like it is taking the future and colonializing it. It's putting your children in debt. It's putting your children in a certain problematic situation, which then makes that central power all the mightier. So, that multiplication effect might be something. Mr. Jockin.
Just to add, we talked this before about wisdom being at least a extended time window preference of evaluation. No? And that tends to actually be really when it means you're that tends to be one of the problems here, is that usually the window of analysis is too narrow, which is ironic. Maybe that's the way to harmonize this, because there is a difference between making judgments and assessments and understanding based on a larger time window of reference. Those can be either past, present, or future oriented, right? But it's a durational extension, right, of a whole set versus a kind of pulling, right, anchored to say, no, we're going to actually impose this condition onto the future. Because you're right, that's the whole, because debt's a very famous example of that. The problem with debt is basically says we're going to get the goods now financed by the future, because we're going to make a presumption that we will be better in the future than the past. Which naturally makes sense. That is true. Actually, it's internally valid, internally coherent when we have an inflationary assumption that $1 today will be worth more than $1 tomorrow because inflation is by default happening. But that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because inflation already exists. It's not because by nature that has to exist inherently.
No, I think that's a wonderful comment, and maybe this also makes me think of the risk-taking question, because there seems to be a difference between risking the future or risking other people's future and risking your future, right? And also risking the future tends to require a certain imagining of what the future is that makes you think that risk will work out, which right there is very problematic because there are so many assumptions that go into that. And also you say, yes, we can risk our children's future because we're going to create a big enough pie where they'll have the money to pay for it when their time comes, right? So the idea of risking the future or other people's future is tied to a certain assumption of the direction that risk would go, right? That seems to be very different There seems to be a difference between taking a risk in general and taking your risk, or a risk for you, or a risk that is going to put a certain demand on you, right? And Mr. Parsons, thank you, sir. So there's something, yeah, absolutely. There's something courageous about risk taking. And a great virtue of capitalism is absolutely the risk-taking potential, right? And I would also say that if the system today, if you look at the system today, which I do think it is, where basically you must take risk to get ahead, then from a personal financial position, you need to think about if there is risk in your portfolio. What risks are you taking? Because if you're thinking that you're going to get ahead, quote unquote, or have class mobility or things like that simply by doing what you're told or following the directions or playing it safe, the answer is no, that will not occur. And that doesn't mean you need to change your life, but you need to make sure you're okay with how it is, right? You've got to take risk. That's what you need to own stock. You need to own equity if you believe in that, or you need to start an entrepreneurship, or you need to do something that is going to make you as a employer or business owner offer something quote unquote unique that has potential in a market sphere. If you do not do that, if you simply think that I will earn a paycheck, I will save it, and I will go from there, I am very sorry to say that it is very unlikely you will get ahead. And that's just how the system is now. So there's a personal finance dimension to that. But then there is also simply, it is absolutely true that a virtue of capitalism is risk-taking, which incentivizes courage and incentivizes people to explore and to try new things, right? The issue becomes once you have a certain financial capitalism, the risk-taking moves into away from the individual person taking the risk of a startup or an entrepreneur to the financial assets themselves and a certain risk of buying an equity or risk of debt, right? So I almost want to say maybe a distinction that could be brought in here is a personalized risk versus a depersonalized risk or something like that. Maybe there's a different there. And the problem is that a lot of the risk we're seeing in the system now is more of a depersonalized risk, which only actually seems possible by risking the future. Now, if you risk your future by a personalized risk, well, that is the kind of courage that actually is necessary for creating wealth. So that's a really good thing. But the problem, perhaps because of the lack of humanities training, is we weren't able to follow the shift. There was a gradual shift of cultivating personalized risk-taking for wealth creation and courage to a gradual movement to a depersonalized risk-taking that was more based on financial assets, which, of course, don't get me wrong, there's very real risk if you were to, say, buy Apple stock and the tariffs have hit you bad and you've lost 20%. I'm not saying it's not difficult, but I think it is quite easy to see that that risk is different in kind from the risk of starting Apple or the risk of starting a business or something like that, right? There's still risk, but you see the problem is it is the risk I guess I want to say your money is actually almost taking the risk more than you. Like your money as a depersonalized object is more of what's at risk than it is you, Mr. Jockin.
Just to build on this, isn't that interesting? I'm kind of circling back with the point of the language of capital, the language of finance. It's almost I did that where I should have said financialization because capitalist is like capital is way more abstract as a concept, because basically, but it does point to a very inherent metaphysical orientation, right, of transformation of object into activity, right? But with that said, notice when people speak in this language, the corporate talk, the financialization talk, as their way of existence, you notice that depersonalizing that is. That's why I just want to share that note. So actually, the sign we're seeing of your intuition about this, Daniel, of this abstractional aggregation that does not have actual being, does not have life to it. It's dead in that sense. The reason why we can say this is because when people are speaking this way and orienting their lives around this, and that's the parameterization of possibilities around that domain, it's deadening. And we need to do everything we can to fight against it, right? Kind of like there's almost like this fleet. Because especially when there's this and abstraction always, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the idea of telos and life, alienation is when there's a separation of the two, right? When the activity of doing something with activity of life is no longer with a telos attached to it, it's separated. The act of separation is abstractional. That's what abstraction is, at least from Aristotle's account, right? The act of seeing the geometric circle in a bronze sphere is because that's an act of that's a separation. That's what you're doing with noose. With noose, you're separating. So I'm just thinking through that's what is the experience of that, and kind of what that feels like is a very depersonalized existence, because it's actually not contacted to the person, to like you as an individuated entity. And you can even sense that through the activities through that, like starting a business versus putting stock in it. Yeah, because what's in the stake here is a person putting their time, attention, and awareness, and everything else in it, versus an abstract object called money, which is standing reserve. I mean, capital. That's why capital, in that sense, is standing reserve in the most perfect sense. It's activity stored symbolically into fungible liquid asset that can be moved anywhere and applied to anything at any time. So I just want to close on those notes. Very great conversation. I'm kind of fun talking through with this with you.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. And for me, that provides the framing, which is the problem is the depersonalization of risk. And what we have to do is repersonalize risk. And a problem with the STEM is that it can depersonalize. The problem with the capital nation state, it can depersonalize at a kind of a greater and more systemic scale. If STEM contributes to depersonalization, that's very problematic. But of course, the problem with the humanities that we now have is because we haven't made relations central. Instead of personalizing, they've individuated. They've separated into these fragmented little structures that have nothing to do with one another. So repersonalization as a certain project, a repersonalization of capital and risk also is going to require the capacities to handle the person. And of course, this is all alluding to depersonalization as AI, the logic of capital AI, depersonalization. The saving of the human, then, the conviviality and the extension of the human is going to be tied to a repersonalization of risk. And then, of course, the key to risk is how is risk not suicide? Because repersonalizing suicide, stupidity is not the way. Risk is such an interesting word because it's only meaningful if it entails a certain wisdom. Like if you just mean do something stupid, do something dangerous, that's not really risk. Risk is a word as opposed to danger that has, or stupidity or something. There's a trace of thinking in the word risk. The word risk suggests a certain discernment, right? So if we're going to repersonalize risk, then we're also, that by definition suggests a certain capacity of relation to risk and thinking risk that may tie to what we were saying earlier in the conversation with language and personality. Mr. Jockin, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, I was going to say the fool. The fool is the opposite. Yeah. A fool is someone who just does things and there's no wisdom, there's no insight at all in what they're doing.
Yeah, that's correct. And if Deleuze is correct to some degree that the only way to avoid capture is a line of flight, well, of course, the risk of what I call cheap Deleuzianism is everyone just becomes a fool then. But that's where you're dealing with that's when you're dealing with Nash equilibrium, not with non-rationality, but with irrationality. Those are not the same thing. So being able to tell the difference between irrational foolishness and non-rationality as a necessity to avoid rational impasses is a very fine discernment and very, very important, which I think is basically encapsulated by thinking about the repersonalization of risk. And unless we do that, and we continue to, in our language, use a language of depersonalized risk, which, I mean, you could almost argue the following. Because risk is so difficult, if you don't have training in the humanities, it's almost just inevitable you're going to depersonalize it, that you're going to move it away from you onto objects or to financial departments, because literally residing in risk, keeping it in risk is so demanding that if you don't have those capacities, it's basically inevitable that there will be a certain slow depersonalization of risk. So you could say that evidence that we have not had the humanities to train human capacities is precisely in the depersonalization of risk that defines our system and our language. And our language does not help at all. We're always looking basically, I mean, you could argue we're constantly looking for depersonalized language now. We're constantly looking for language that gets us out of the language per se. Even when we kind of, the way we talk, or we say, you're always, there are different ways people talk that is almost kind of removing their involvement in what is being discussed. This would have to be elaborated on, but there's a habit of depersonalization that is tied to a habit of depersonalizing risk, because you don't want to take risk in relationships or conversations. So there's a avoiding of risk. And so telling the difference between, but then again, I suppose one could say that all of, perhaps all of virtue ethics is tied to a certain personalization of risk, right? A certain like how to actually be able to hold that tension and have it go into a virtuous direction, which then there seems to be something utterly necessary for the possibility of the strike of beauty for a repersonalization of risk. And can we do that or not? So I find that a very helpful framing. And I appreciate you being here for the possibility of that framing. So thank you, Mr. Jockin. It's been a treat speaking with you today. And all the best to you, sir. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you dealing with the technical glitches as well. So thank you, sir.